This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, JD, it's time for you.
Norval, do you hear me, Norval? We got me?
Yep, sure can.
Very good. And you got the screen, right?
Yep, you've got the screen.
All right. Well, glad to be back. And I guess I should say first, congratulations to the Blue Ridge section on the success of your webinars over the last few years. It's been great to be part of some of those, and great to see it take off like it has. So with no further ado, I will jump in, and I will say that my whole presentation can almost be summed up with one question, and that is, do you see facilitation as a role, an activity, if you will, or as a craft? And I think if you answer the question as a role or an activity, I would say you would always be maybe a good facilitator, but you'll never be a great one. To be a great one, you really have to take this on your shoulders and say, I'm going to take this on as a craft, and it is something different that I've got to achieve. I'll work through about 20 minutes or so of the first two bullets here, kind of give everybody a little background definition of facilitation, and then my 5 points on what I think good to great means. Then I will, as advertised, take that material into probably our quality and our reliability world and our risk world, and talk about FMEAs and RCAs and decision and fault trees for summary. I've aimed it at an intermediate level today. That's why I started good to great. I'm assuming probably everybody on the call has had to do some type of facilitation in their job. As the program says, I've found that most professionals in our business have learned it on the job, though, and don't have a lot of formal training. And so really what I'm trying to do today is take you from what you probably consider to be a good facilitator to give you some helpful hints on how to be a great one. The definition I like the best is here from Michael Wilkerson, and it's means that facilitation has a couple different pieces. One, it is a structured meeting, right? I like to call them workshops, but it's a structured meeting. There's a leader, that's you, that's the facilitator. There's participants, usually those are cross-functional participants. There are predefined steps, and we'll talk a lot about those today. And then that result is a created, understood, and accepted solution result by all the participants. And I think this is probably the strength of the definition is understanding, but it's also where I think a lot of business unit managers and operations managers say, what's the hard part about facilitation? I manage a group of people. I bring them to consensus every day. No big deal. I can become a facilitator. And that's not really quite true. It's as far as being a manager versus a leader, a manager versus a facilitator. In this context, you usually have a lot of people from a cross-functional perspective. You're trying to get information out of them. They don't necessarily work for you. It's just a different beast. But there's our definition of facilitation. What makes a good facilitator? This is some standard things that I think even as a good facilitator, you probably all have. I'm not going to read all the bullets in my presentations to you. I know Norval, as he said, will have the slides for you later, so I'll let you just look at those. But I think that's the fundamental of what we have to minimally do as a good facilitator. And then our basic responsibilities. Again, this is textbook type stuff, but our job is not necessarily to be the smartest person in the room per se, but we're to set up the coordination of the who, what, when, where, and how. We control the agenda. We set the objectives for the meeting. We establish the expectations from the group. We help facilitate the group that's presenting and sharing the information, and then we provide closure. And so those are the basic responsibilities of what we should be doing as facilitators, good or great. So some basic troubleshooting tips, and again, aiming at an intermediate level. You guys are probably all familiar with these, but I'll just put it there for completion's sake. One of my pet peeves is staying on task and on time. I think disrespectful if you don't stay on time, and I think it really turns your audience off on you as a facilitator if you can't manage the time and the information properly. The second thing is obviously troubleshooting. You're going to have unproductive behavior. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the presentation, but you've got to have some ways to call time out or to work through some unproductive behavior by participants. And finally, although I think facilitators are best when they know a little something about the subject matter, yours is not the duty as the facilitator, good or great, to know everything about the material. It's really to facilitate other people to come forward and talk about it. So you really got to have a plan to make sure your subject matter experts and your cross-functional participants all can come in and have debate. So that's a little bit of the background. And now I want to talk about the 5 things that I think really the billing of this whole webinar was really to talk about going from good to great. So I'll give you just 5 things, and I think it can all be broken down into these things. The ability to ask powerful questions, by far and away, probably out of the gate, the most important thing. I think the hard work probably comes in the next 2. You've got to have a really good, strong pre-session participant exchange. This is where you're doing your homework and your background. Good facilitators don't always do this. Great ones always do. Your exercises have to engage, and we're not talking about death by PowerPoint or reports where the production people give you their report and the quality people their report. We can read reports. These sessions, great facilitated sections, are about engagement, and the report should almost be homework for the group before they get there. To do that, you've got to have some kind of bag of tricks, some kind of tool bag with some pre-done exercises in it. The 4th is you're going to have disruption, and you've got to anticipate and work through that to be great. And then 5th, it's just the rhythm of how things are going to ebb and flow. You've got to keep momentum, whether that's in a single session, multiple sessions, even multiple sessions over years, to control that tempo. Questions? I heard something in the background. I got a message for somebody wanting to be the presenter. Kind of strange. I'm gonna keep rolling, Norval.
Okay.
Okay. Good to great. Great because it's hockey season. It's about Stanley Cup season here in the U.S. And so I'll start with my Carolina Hurricanes, who have not been #1 since 2005, 2006. But that'll be the first topic we'll talk about, powerful questions. 2 trains of thoughts here about going from good to great. The first is your questions. Great facilitators always have the imagination phrase to get the participants really juiced up and almost the answers coming off their tongue as soon as the question's asked. Some of those words that you should be leading in with as a great facilitator are things like think about, imagine, if, consider, things that really capture the visualization and imagination of the people that you're talking to, and then ask the direct question. Now, before I go to give you a couple of examples, I want to distinguish that from hypotheticals. We're not asking if you could be king for the day. We're not asking if you could solve all the problems of the world. As a facilitator, you need to keep your group on track and within the problem frame of what you're doing. But the imagination is to get them more active in the subject matter that you're talking about. So avoid the hypotheticals, but you still want to get them into the imagination. Here's a couple examples. So here's one about just the procurement process. The powerful facilitator would say, let's move to problems with the procurement process. Think about something you've purchased lately. Consider the real problems, consider what got you frustrated, and then ask the question, what are some of the frustrating problems with the current procurement process? That is the powerful way to do it. When I'm in a session, when somebody just says, hey, what's the problems with the procurement session? Oh, come on, guys, somebody say something, right? That's a weak facilitator. That's an average facilitator. You really want to get into people's heads with the questions you lead into so that they're ready to give your responses based on their experience. Another one could be this. Remember a recent time when you had a pump failure. This is like something for like a FMEA. Think about some of the things that happened that you would have expected. Think about some of the things that surprised you. Now, what are some of the ways that a pump can fail, or this pump can fail? That's the powerful way. The weak way is to what are some of the ways the pump can fail. Just very bland and sterile and probably not going to get great responses. So things to watch the next time that you were in a facilitated session as a participant and then also as the facilitator. There's also a string of questions, and I'm going to go through all these, but things that you do as a facilitator, the way you ask a question to say, let's say that someone makes a comment and you don't believe everyone understands what they said, but you think you do. Acceptable, let me tell everybody in the group what Bill really is saying. The great way is to make it personal, to call Bill by name. Bill, it sounds like you were saying this. Is that right? That's the powerful, that's the great facilitator that's using that approach. And also, maybe you're not sure anybody understands what the person's saying. Acceptable would be, I just don't understand your comment. You have to repeat that, Bill or Jill. The great is, Jill, this is important to you because of why, and to engage. I like this example because it actually happened just a few weeks ago. As I was facilitating a session, and I had a participant look at one of the participants who had said something that I don't think anybody understood, and he asked the question this way, the great way. And what did I know automatically off the board that I didn't know before was that person was probably a pretty good facilitator too. And so now I had an ally in the room that could also help me control the room. And so even the way you say it as a participant or as a facilitator is the great way to do it, is to call the name and to restate the question in that way. So powerful questions, number one. Number two, the second category I'll give you is the pre-session participant exchange. And two reminds me of two Beagles. So those are my two Beagles, Bo and Jackson. Nothing to do with Auburn, although they did win the SEC basketball championship this weekend. But this is number two on my list of 5 for going good to great. Couple mentions here, and overall what I would say, and I like Kaner's diamond of participation here, is that you're really setting the tone for a process that you'll facilitate that looks like the diagram on the right. You'll start with the question or the intent, which is really what you're doing with the pre-session participant exchange of understanding purpose, product, participants, issues, and process to establish those. And then as you go into the facilitated session, you're going to kind of start diverging. You're going to start getting different ideas and participation. And then you're going to go to that part that Kaner calls the groan zone, where everyone really starts to struggle. And it's part of every facilitated session at some point before, again, you come back to convergence. But what you want to be able to do with this pre-session participant exchange, good to great again, you want to be able to set that diamond or set that frame so that you can have the boundaries done so you can move organized and effectively through this participation diamond. So a couple of things you're going to ask for. One is from your executive sponsor. And I know in some of these cases, the executive sponsor may be well above your pay grade, right? It's the plant manager, it's the chief executive. Doesn't matter. What I would say is if you've been asked to do a facilitated session and you're going to commit to being the facilitator, you're a crafts person now, and it's time to be dedicated to your craft, and you've got to go forward to the ultimate customer, which is your executive sponsor, and insist that you make some time, 15, 30 minutes somehow, just to sit down and map out the expectations, the where, what, when, and how, the outcomes they expect, and how that person, how that executive sponsor or sponsors will define success. This is really, in part, framing your problem up and what you're there to facilitate. Now, there's a positive piece of this I can say this way. The positive side of this is how you get the outcome at the end. Remember the definition of facilitation, that positive result, because this makes sure you get the result. The more defensive or negative way to look at this is this. Your executive sponsors, a lot of times, and they're leaders and politicians and those type of things, if they don't get what they want, they usually change the frame on you, right? That's a natural human characteristic. And if you've not worked through this process, you're going to be the victim of somebody saying, you know, kind of, you idiot, you've solved the wrong problem. You've facilitated the group down the bad path. And so I like to look at things positively, which is you're going to get the right result. But this also, as a facilitator, is a big part of protecting yourself and making sure you're not burned later by somebody changing the frame on you when you do come away from the group. The next part of this item number 2 on good to great is the pre-session participant exchange with the actual participants. And it happens in a couple different ways. One is interviews. And I'm often asked, do you interview everybody that's going to be on your team? And the answer to that is yes. I try to at least pick up the phone and talk to them for 5 or 10 minutes to understand maybe a little bit about them and what they may be expecting from the session. Hopefully I also put a little bit of excitement in there to engage them, to make sure they show up at the session and give me 100%. The other thing we can do with participants, and I like to do this, is to do the pre-session survey, which I keep it simple. I use basic SurveyMonkey type surveys. I've got other survey tools, but SurveyMonkey works just as well. But send out 5 or 10 questions in advance. Get those answers from those participants. It gets them energized, it gets them thinking, but it also enables you as a facilitator to hit the ground running when you start. And of course, another part of the pre-session exchange is good practices. You may not be an expert at everything you're facilitating, but you should know a little bit about it, and you should be able to learn a lot more. And so take the time to understand, like in my role in the Environmental Management Commission chairman, what are other states doing? In the South Carolina water plan, we may say, what are other states doing? And so that's some of the things you need to do up front to have your homework done. Good to great. The third piece of this is exercises that engage. 3 for the Three Stooges, just because I think they're funny, but I also think they're engaging. And as I said before, in these exercises that engage, we're not looking for stale PowerPoints. We're not looking for death by PowerPoint. We're looking for actual exercises. And so I'll ask you the question that Jennifer Garner asked you about your credit card. What's in your wallet? And I'll say this about facilitation. What's in your equipment bag as a craftsman? What's in your bag of tricks? In other words, if I'm an electrician, I have a bag of tools. If I'm a carpenter, I have a bag of tools. If I'm a professional baseball player, I got an equipment bag, right? I'm serious about my sport. I'm a craftsman. I have things that I carry with me. And so what I would challenge each of you with is to say, if you don't have an equipment bag or a bag of tricks or something like that, then you're probably not real serious about being a facilitator, because you need these 3 type of things on your left that I'll talk about to really take you from good to great. So the first part of the toolkit is some pretty simple stuff, right? These are the props. These are the things that help you facilitate and take the action away from you and participants and focus them on a prop. I use a picture frame. I start a lot of my chartering sessions and my framing sessions with literally putting the picture frame on the wall that you see there by my bag and say what's in the frame and what's out of the frame, so we can establish what the boundaries are. I also like to do, as I talk about today, is I work a lot with equipment and human factors and human errors. Either have some simple stuff that you can see that I can carry, like ball valves and gate valves, or have my sites bring in equipment to the session so that we can actually look at the equipment and use those for props. But I can carry some basic stuff by myself, as well as have an audience response system. Now, audience response systems are not that expensive anymore. There's probably 6 or 8 major kinds. The ones you see there, if you ask, is Turning Point. It's been my preference for more than a decade, but it's just a simple way that people can use clickers and anonymously give you results without having to express their views, especially when we get into some complicated things that we'll talk about later about human factors and root cause analysis. So, but have those tools with you, those props. The other thing is the exercises. And I don't use these exercises everywhere, but guess what? I'm prepared. So there's 6 that I have in my bag that I've really got the exercise written out. I don't really have time to explain them all, but they're really things that if I see an exercise or a breakout session or something going wrong or some kind of confusion, I can pull these up and get my audience engaged very rapidly. There's 6 things there that I use. The other bullet with the Palisade demos, I use Decision tool suite a lot for my risk analysis and stuff. So I've got some canned runs in Excel and some demos of at-risk big picture, which is mind mapping and precision tree, so that I can actually show the audience how you build a decision tree example if we need to see it. And then, of course, because I do some stuff with equipment, I've got an E4 and I've got a 9070, so I've got some demo slides and some demo material where I could show people what thermography actually looks like or vibration actually looks like and how you do it. So again, it doesn't matter exactly what they are, but somewhere as a great facilitator, you've got to be prepared and you've got to have this tool bag where you've got things that can engage people and keep them active and things you can pivot with. The last thing I'll say is, a great carpenter doesn't need to bring his own nails to the job site necessarily, but it's nice to have a few in the truck. And I would say this, if you're serious about being a facilitator and you want to be a great one, carry a few extra things in your bag with you just to make sure, hey, I got sticky notes or name tags or a couple magic markers. It's not a lot of mass to carry around even on planes, but have a few backups with you when you go somewhere in that bag. Fourth, and that's the fourth steam turbine generator at New Orleans that provides power to the city, but this one is kind of moving out of that preparation stage and into the session. But to fourth on the list of good to great is anticipate disruption. And I will say this, as a great facilitator, your job is to really push this needle in the challenge zone and the change zones and the shake it up zone. And when you do that, every once in a while, you're going to tip the boat over into disruption. And so it's not a question of whether disruption is going to happen. It is going to happen if you're good at what you do, if you're great at what you do. And so you've got to be prepared to pivot off of that. So good is what I described a little earlier. You've got parking lots and you've got called breaks, those timeouts where things get sticky and there's confrontation between participants. You can do that. That's textbook stuff. That's average stuff. It's good stuff. Some great things you can do to help with anticipating disruption. One is those props. You may have seen it in my bag, but I've got a bathroom break sign, a bathroom sign. And I actually give that to my participants, to one of them, and they can call their own bathroom breaks. And so they became tools for me to, if we get too tense or too disrupted in some places, they can actually call for the break, and it doesn't have to be me debating whether we needed a break. I also have some King's hats and some Jester hats. You may have saw those back there. But I actually use those, not all the time, but sometimes when I have unruly crowds or people that like to be, smart asses or kings of the table or whatever it is, I'll let the participants hand them the hat to wear, and that kind of humbles people. So those are some of the props you can use. And again, you don't have to use them for every one, but have some of those and be willing to engage your audience, your participants, to help you. The other thing I like is other facilitators in the room. I mentioned the thing a couple weeks ago where we actually had one of the participants was a pretty good facilitator too. So use those people in the room and be able to talk to those people in your pre-session meetings to strategically use them when you do have disruption. And then finally, the third thing that I think makes a great component of anticipating disruption is really to have a facilitation team. If you have your executive sponsor in the session with you, if you have a note taker or a scribe or something, establish this facilitation leadership team up front. And instead of just taking the idea to the parking lot, say, let the facilitation team think about that at the break or at lunch or overnight or until the next session next week, and then we'll come back to you. But it really makes it look like you're being more proactive than just sticking something on the parking lot, which a lot of times participants don't even believe you'll get back to the parking lot. So this is just a proactive way to do that. The last thing, the fifth thing that I'll give you in my good to great is to control the ebb and flow, the tempo, whatnot. It's really about keeping momentum going, either during the session, between sessions, or from start to completion. But there's always going to be an ebb and flow in projects that you facilitate. And I'd say this, I'm a sailor, a competitive sailor, used to be, and I'll just sail. But if the tide's out and the boats are dry, it's not going to be very, very productive to go sailing. And so what I say sometimes is you just get in these long sessions and it's not productive. You've got to know when it's time to quit and don't get bothered by it, and just don't force a team into an unproductive zone. The other things I would say is you've got to have, as we've mentioned before, the backup exercises, break it into groups, multiple facilitators, all not just to take care of problems, but also to be able to pivot and to do great things to keep the momentum going. Some of the things I would say within a session is the different exercises. And so sometimes you've got to pivot. Most people love breakout groups. And so if you're working through some session or you're in a horseshoe event or you're working through some exercises, they're not working, breaking into breakout groups is usually a good default to pivot just to try something different. But you as the leader, you as the facilitator have got to decide when it's time to move to different exercises, even within your plan session. You can move to different locations. I talked about the water plan in South Carolina. We met at the same location for 6 months. I sensed the group was getting a little stale and a little routine, so we went to a different location just to shake it up a little bit. And then finally, some of you do annual planning meetings and annual budgets and those type of things, and those meetings get really boring. And one of the ones I'll mention here at the bottom was one that Clay Duffy and I have been doing, have done a couple times, called Shaking It Up. And this was really where we moved to an interactive type format with annual board retreats for his board of directors. And so, but just different ways you have to pivot to keep the tempo moving. And great facilitators know how to incorporate into their programs. So now, as I kind of round around to the bottom, I want to go into a few of the technical areas we talked about in the promotion here. One is failure modes and effects analysis, and I think that's a common one most of the people in this room do a lot of. And just as always, love to give you the definition of what it is, and this is from ASQ for those that don't know. But basically what we're working through with failure modes and effects is it can be for design, it can be for a manufacturing process, it can be for service. I've used it for a wide variety of different things, but we're really getting down into process analysis. What can go wrong? What are the modes of failure? What are the effects and consequences of that? What are the causes of it? What's the risk of it happening? What can we do about it? And so these are tremendously long sessions that we have to go through. And I'll just give you some reference material. Carl Carlson's one of the leaders in this field with failure modes and effects analysis. He may be on the call, but this is some of the things he says that are basic skills for facilitating FMEAs. And again, guess what? They're very similar to general facilitation overall. I would say this from me, from going from good to great, is again, preparation is critically important. You may not understand everything about it, but you need to do your homework as a great facilitator and work through. This was actually a system example, but get the background information, all that you can get that's published, and talk to subject matter experts. We even moved to a system in our facilitated FMEAs where we have subject matter expert sheets that we actually develop before we even start the session. And so a lot of the fundamental information that we've got from historical records and from conversations, we've got into one document so that participants can move through it fairly quickly. Two other things I would say, and one of the last one will be kind of controversial probably, but go ahead up front and decide what you think you and your facilitation team to think the problem frame is. You need to know the physical boundaries, whether that's the fence line or the plant boundaries or whatnot, or the operational boundaries of what operational functions touch it. But you don't need to walk into those sessions cold and ask participants to redefine or define the boundary. Have something that you think it needs to be, and the same with the function statement. Controversially here would probably be preload your FMEA sheets, and I will say this, I'm not a fan of walking in with canned sheets and letting people just edit them. That's not what we should do as facilitators. But I also think that there are a lot of routine things that you may work with, pumps or valves or whatnot, that really, to show respect for people's time and to show that you've done your preparation, some of that material can be preloaded, and that you can use that material depending on how stagnant a session gets or whatnot. But it makes you prepared, it makes you ready, and it makes you show that you're really respectful of people's time in a very, what I would call almost always a grinding process. I like to use in this multiple facilitators. I think to be a great FMEA facilitator, you need multiple facilitators. I don't always have the opportunity to bring a peer of my experience level with me, but sometimes I get junior people with me, and almost always I can always find somebody in the client side or the facility side that wants to be a better facilitator and get them to do the failure modes and effects with us. That also helps the participants. Sometimes they're a little harder, but sometimes they show a little mercy and they also understand a lot of the details that we have to go through. So that's an important thing to incorporate as well. The other thing on FMEAs that I like is don't be hesitant. I like to have them on the sites, to facilitate it on the sites where the action actually is. And I think instead of those long grinding sessions where you overplan the amount of material you can cover, it just helps sometimes as you control the tempo and keep your momentum, that a great facilitator is not too concerned about losing control, that they don't take a site trip or a walkover and really just get everybody out of the room and into the field talking to the people that operate or maintain the equipment. So I think that's another great thing that great facilitators do to control the tempo and keep momentum going. Root cause analysis was next on the agenda, and root cause analysis is a little bit, for me, it can be part of root cause analysis, but root cause analysis, failures happen, and so folks are really sensitive, and there is a greater greater emphasis on maybe being conscious of your environment when you're facilitating or leading a root cause analysis. A couple things I'll say on root cause that makes it different than some of the other facilitation is because the failures happen, you're almost always going to do detailed interviews before you have a group session. Not always, but usually. That means when you come together, you're probably going to be reviewing summary material, which are things like a causal factor timeline, which I show here in the picture, and try to make sure that you've got all the notes right and you've got your timeline and your models and that kind of thing all constructed properly with the group. The other thing we know about root cause analysis is that usually the root causes come down to some kind of management problems or organizational problems. They're just not an operator or a single piece of equipment. So in that context, there's a lot of sensitivities by management about what you may find. And so RCAs may have to be facilitated. They do have to be facilitated a little differently sometimes than other types of facilitations. One of the things I'll say, 10 tips here, and again, I like to recognize people but that are kind of leaders in the business, but here's 10 tips for RCAs, and I know there's a lot of software out there to guide you through this. I'm not going to endorse software. I use a couple different types of RCA software, and sometimes we just do it our own way. So it really is a thing, but some tips for you to leave behind. Here's some tips of a great facilitator from Mark Paradis, but what JD Solomon would say, and I would say this as a great facilitator, is keep your RCAs simple. There's clarity and meaning in simple paths and simple things, and build the complexity into things as you go, as you work through the process. I like this from Bob Latino, again, kind of a leader in the field, maybe the leader in the field of RCAs right now. But I would say his points are great, but one of the things I want to pull to you from a great facilitator, I think, is his fourth bullet there, which is allow pictures if you cannot understand words. And I would go one step further to say, always use picture. So a picture's worth 1,000 words, and we're encumbered by language, not just nationalities, but just our own meaning of certain terms like reliability and availability and even risk. We don't always have great terms for. And so seeing things on a map really helps you become a great facilitator, because it attracts attention to the map and the flow of things, the business process and the flow, not just to getting caught in traps and meanings of words. I think as far as the powerful questions we talked about, the good to great, this is really important for RCAs, because you really need to get people to reconstruct where they were and how they imagine things. I don't have time in this brief webinar to really go through examples of that, but we've been able to find these examples in other places. And I would say the part I would leave you with beyond these imagination phrases that we talked about earlier would be that you really need to ask piercing type questions. And by piercing, I'll show you in a second, but we got a lot of software that tells you certain standard questions to ask at certain different pieces. We're all trained in the 5 whys, those that do this kind of work, and it can get kind of stale. And one of the stale things that I'll give you is an ecosystem problem. This is what I call the Columbo moment, and I think all great facilitators of RCA needs their Colombo moments. But this was an ecosystem. This was a estuary that had been an inlet that had been blocking up on the coast. It's probably different than most of the audience here because we're usually manufactured people, but we were doing this with a group of folks. And we got a bunch of people together. We asked the 5 whys, and we determined the flow here in the ocean is from the left to right, north to south is left to right. We determined that the backwater had been cut off and that there wasn't as much water in the marsh, and models were built, and coastal geologists and coastal engineers got involved, and they talked about how the water, when the water was cut off from the backwater, would move from north to south and lengthen down the channel because there wasn't this flush of water that came out as great anymore. And this was just a natural cause of probably what was happening as the backwater got cut off. The interesting part about this, we had a great theory. We asked our 5 whys, we had all our models, we had all our work kind of built, we were building to a point, and then I had my Colombo moment, which some of you may not know who Colombo is, but he was a TV detective back from the, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, and he always had those kind of bumbling questions that said just one more question, and sometimes they were obvious, stupid, whatever you want to call them, but they were usually very poignant and piercing. And so my Colombo moment here was, okay, guys, I got the theory about the sand moving, the water being cut off and moving further to the south. But why is that sand there? That sand didn't come from the inland. It came from the coast. And so at the very end of this first phase, it was aha moment. You know, some of that beach renourishment they've been doing for the past decade may have actually been coming in from the ocean and had nothing to do with the backside issue. But it took the piercing question from the facilitator, even at the end, to ask the bumbling Colombo question, one more thing. And I think that's the role of a powerful facilitator, is to really be bold in those cases. I'll move on to briefly just a few minutes on human factors analysis. I like to do a lot in human reliability and human factors analysis. I like the human factors analysis and classification system. You can probably see here there's 4 tiers. There's unsafe acts, precondition, and then unsafe supervision and organizational influences at the top tiers. And I'll add that one of the things as great facilitators do is recognize that some of the supervisory and organizational stuff is very sensitive. And so my audience response system becomes very important here because it allows me to ask questions of my groups and let them show an answer on the board that we can either show it anonymously that we can either dive into or not dive into. But I've captured the information in a way that most people aren't really comfortable expressing verbally or in writing because they're not really sure how management will respond. But again, an exercise that engages and is also non-threatening, that allows me to get the information I need. I only have, as I kind of wind down here, because I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but I want to give you 2 things on decision and fault trees. One is actually 3. One is the difference between the 2. Again, a good ASQ definition, but remember that fault trees are really that deductive part. They're the looking backwards. They're how the system looks, how it operates, how it's failed, looking back. And the only difference between the event tree or the decision tree is that it looks forward. And so it's trying to come off a single point and say, what will things be like in the future? And you can read those definitions, but trees are kind of trees in the way that they work. And so as I'm facilitating trees, 2 things become important. First of all, use your software. This is Precision Tree from Palisade on the top right, and this is a mind mapping tool on the bottom left. You can use a number of different softwares to do this, but spend a little pre-time trying to do your draft tree in the pre-session preparation. As you get ready for things, have that ready to go and have that in the chute in the back of your mind, and make sure the math works out as you build your tree. And again, you don't have to be exact, but a great facilitator, again, is prepared when they go into the session and has a feel for where things need to flow. And so this helps you kind of know the flow. The big however is to the second part of the third bullet in good to great is you need exercises that engage. A computer printout does not engage. So while you do this in your pre-session prep and to get ready, you always want to do it by hand with your group. And so always do it by hand, always let them develop it, and always keep them engaged by building the trees, and it will have a lot of meaning for them. So a few things as I move to summary to close in the next few minutes. These are my 5 good to great items here. If you can take parts of these and master these 5, I think you'll move from a good to a great facilitator. I think you need to reflect back on, or should reflect back on from time to time, what it is that you even do when you facilitate. And again, those are the structured meeting, predefined steps, and result that is created, understood, and accepted by all the participants. I don't know the source of the content of this slide. I've used it and I like it, so I'll say 2 things from it. First, the background knowledge is only one essential part of mastering a craft, of being a craftsman. And so while I hope this webinar has been helpful to you, and I hope some of you probably have some formal training in facilitation, it's only part of the process. And so here are some things, bullets that I like and kind of twisted into my own to some degree to say this is what you need. I like to call attention to the 5th bullet, experience in different situations. I compare it to the competitive sailboat racing I used to do a lot of. You know, anybody can sail on and race on a clear sunny day like on the left, but it's when you have to go in all times and all tides, like the picture on the right, that it really separates the good from the great. And I would say that's the same for facilitation. Anybody can come in and do it when it's smooth and easy. It's when you have those disruptions and choppy waters where you really see the great be prepared and have their tools ready. So that experience in different situations is huge. And I'd also say, as a baseball coach and a sailor, I don't do much with music and dancing, but most of you probably do. How many things in your life has been acquired by taking a class with not any real experience or really no mentors to help you? And it's very little. I coach baseball, and it's everything I've talked about in a lot of ways. The preparation, the good questions, the being ready for adversity, the momentum, they're all part of not just facilitation, but almost any craft you do to take you from good to great. So I really leave you with the final question of, if you look at facilitation as a role or an activity, you're probably going to be good. But if you approach it as a craft, you'll probably be great. And I hope the presentation, the webinar today, and the brief time we've had has been helpful to show you a few tips. So with that, Norval, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, JD. First question that we have, looks like it came directly to me. If you're ready for questions here, JD, the first one is, how do you manage exercises that engage when your audience is virtual? And what are some best practices or recommendations when dealing with a virtual audience?
Yeah, that's good. And it is tougher. But again, with the webinar and the clickers, I like to use the audience response systems, the polling type systems. And some of our webinar tools like WebEx and whatnot have those available. So I think that is the primary way to do it. I think a secondary way to do it is you've got to build a lot more into your pre-session meeting, and so that you almost have to have things a little bit organized and queued up to flow into the facilitated session, because it is hard to facilitate when you can't see faces and expressions. And so virtually it gets to be very tough, admittedly. Those would be the big things I would say, is use your audience response systems, your polling systems, and then just you got to really orchestrate the meeting a lot tighter with a virtual meeting. But they are tougher.
Okay, moving right along. Next question is tools. How about a laser pointer for the facilitator?
Was that about my presentation, or was that in general for the facilitator?
I think that's a general question.
Yeah, I think I use a laser pointer at times in my tool bag. A lot of times I don't. I was kind of taught at one point that projections boards are sometimes better than PowerPoint projections, and that your ability to walk up with your hands and touch something on a board, either a pre-done hardboard with a graphic on it, or either a whiteboard, but that ability for you or your audience to touch things makes it much more personal than standing back with a pointer where you're almost conjuring thoughts of being in a university lecture hall. But it really depends on the room, and in some cases you've just got to use a pointer because you can't touch it and things are just a little sterile. So.
Okay. The next question we have is, shouldn't the team leader also be involved in the pre-meeting interviews?
Not really. As a facilitator, I like, and it depends on what it is, but I don't want the individual participants as a rule to be intimidated. I want to build rapport as the primary facilitator with each participant to know what their hot buttons are and to start building an almost personal relationship with them. If you bring in the production line manager or the human resources manager or the one of the accounting people or something with you who may be the project manager for what you're doing, it really puts a cloud on that personal relationship. So I would say keep it one-on-one if you can.
Okay, we have one more question here. Someone is asking, what are Deming paddles?
Oh, I don't have a picture, but they're the, when he did the beads with the paddle board. He had a big paddle board and he had red beads and white beads, and he stuck it in and he talked about the probability of things happening. That's what they are. If you go to ASQ World Headquarters, you will see Deming's paddles and his beads there in the lobby. So I've made a set of Deming paddles and boards when I do probability discussions and sampling discussions on some of my projects. Hope that answered that.
Yeah.
What else we got?
We're continuing to get questions here, which is great. Documentation. How do you recommend documenting pre-session activities through post-meeting activities if you are working with a team of facilitators for team continuity?
Yeah, usually, let me try to, I'll start at the beginning, and normally what I recommend and what I do is to really, I keep the pre-session notes fairly general. Root cause analysis may be a different matter where I might want to make them more formal and get them typed up. But normally in the beginning on most of my facilitated sessions, other than root causes, I'm actually just keeping hand notes of that. And if we do anything, we will type up summary notes, but keep those very preliminary and very anonymous, and share just the higher ideas with the group when we get everybody in the session. In the sessions, and as we do facilitated sessions and come to conclusions, I like to go ahead and have a designated secretary or scribe in the bunch. I like for that to be one of the non-participants, what I usually like to push for, so that is truly a neutral, just as I'm a neutral facilitator, not a participant. I like for my secretary / scribe to be that as well. That does not always happen on smaller facilitated sessions and workshops. And in that case, I'll get, one of the staff members to do that, but try to avoid having a participant do it. And then on the final product, it's usually I bring that back, and I'm a consultant, so what I usually do is have my own people type the final notes up so that we can kind of streamline that. It is hard, even on my internal projects inside the company, or as I know most of you probably are in manufacturing, you don't have a lot of admin support, but it needs to be done at some point, and it's usually better for a third party to type them up to make sure that the record is clear and the typos are good or cleaned up. So hope that answers that question. That's a long question though.
Okay, moving on, we continue to get questions, and a lot of them are really good ones here. The next one is, do you have any tips for getting an introverted subject matter expert in a meeting to open up to the rest of the team?
Say an introverted subject. A lot of subject matter experts are they're very extroverted and opinionated, or they're very introverted. I would say you've got to do your work in the pre-session meeting to engage them. That's always the way to make them feel comfortable when they're introverted. The other way is to have some exercises where you just have to have them talk or lead, and you don't want to put them in the uncomfort zone. But the more you can get them in to your facilitated sessions, talking early and talking about what they do, then the better off you'll be. So I try to get my subject matter experts really engaged in the exercises early, of all types. And usually I feel like I get the introverted ones going by letting them talk about what they do. Your main problems I see sometimes is your really opinionated extroverted ones that tend to want to be a little bit disruptive, and you've got to have your plan B for those. So, but I work a lot with introverted subject matter experts. I work a lot with engineers and other specialists, so they tend to be introverted.
Okay, looks like that was the last question that I'm seeing coming up in the chat box. We do have time for one more we can squeeze in before 1 o'clock. While we're waiting for that, reminder that the next webinar after today will be on Thursday, April 11th, and we will be posting that information as well as sharing it with everyone through social media and email as we're going along here. Also in the process of getting out all the February certs, there were close to 300 of them this time to get out to everybody. Better than halfway through them now, so it's a little bit of a slow process getting them emailed because they're individual emails to individual folks, but we'll get them to you here. The goal is to get them to everybody for February before the end of this week, so lofty goals here. Not seeing any other questions, JD. I think it's getting real close to the top of the hour, and I think it is now, so we're going to go ahead and wrap things up for today. I'd like to thank JD for presenting for us today.
Thank you, Norval. And if anything I can do for anybody, please email me or Norval. And whether it's business processes or whether it's facilities and equipment, feel free to call me. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And the other thing too, your dogs were so quiet. Give them extra biscuits for a reward.
It's anyway. Sometimes it's harder at home and sometimes it's harder at the office. It just depends on, there's always challenges, right?
That's true. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll hopefully see you online next time, which will be April 11th. Until then, wish everyone a great rest of the day, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Thanks now. Bye.